To most of its residents, Portsmouth isn't much to look at, but under its rough exterior is a rich history. Much of this history goes unnoticed by the general public. For nearly 4 centuries, African Americans have contributed to the history of Portsmouth. Much of this history remains unknown to the people who live here. The African American Historical Society is changing that, and so is the city of Portsmouth. Located in the heart of the black community, the Portsmouth Colored Community Library, opened in 1945, was established to enhance the knowledge and awareness about African American history, culture, and achievements. In 1997, a group of individuals formed the African American Historical Society of Portsmouth in order to collect, preserve, and promote African Americans in the city of Portsmouth. We begin in this library, the Portsmouth Public Library. This library may look like your typical modern library, but its history is filled with struggle and discrimination.
Ours was the last city on the east coast of its size to be served entirely by a private library. And as a private library, it was for whites only. So in the 1940s, the African American community set up the community library, first as a volunteer operation with donated books, and then the city took it over. And it became really more a public library than the public library was. And Mrs. Edwards was hired as the director, and Charlotte Falk as her assistant. Well, the state decided that all of its professions needed to be licensed, and that there needed to be requirements for those licenses. And the licensing agency for libraries was the state library, and the state librarian was Randolph Church. Of course, the requirement was that you get a master's degree in library science. And of course, none of the librarians in the state had that. So they grandfathered people who were heads of libraries into as professional librarians, gave them a license. With 2 exceptions to my knowledge. One was the head of an academic library, and the other was Mrs. Bertha Edwards. I think not just by coincidence, those 2 librarians were women and African Americans. What Randolph Church said to Mrs. Edwards was, "You're young enough to go back and get your master's degree." Didn't require that of anyone else, including Miss Helen Kirkpatrick, who was the head of the private library and then became head of the public library. Well, in the beginning of the 60s, 2 young dentists, Hugo Owens, who was then head of the NAACP, and James Holly. Hugo went on to become a vice mayor of Chesapeake, and of course, Jim Holly went on to become the longest-serving mayor of Portsmouth. They went into the private library and demanded service, and they were turned down because of their race. So the 2 sued the officers of the Students' Club. This put the city in a real pickle, so what they did then was they got the federal government to give them the beautiful Central Post Office, one of the best eclectic buildings in the state, and combine the 2 libraries in it. Of course, it was massively bigger than the other libraries had been. And that's why I got hired, because they had to hire quite a few people then to fill in the spots. Mrs. Edwards, however, who probably should have been assistant director, at least, if not director, didn't have her license.
We did find out that the history of the Portsmouth Community Library started in the parish house at St. James. And it's because there was a library committee that was formed. And this library committee, and it was blacks and whites. In fact, they met at Monumental United Methodist Church. And these were people that were interested in forming a library. And this was the Portsmouth Community Library, which was at St. James, which is the first. And that was in the late 30s. And that library functioned, it was supposed to be the community library, but many of the citizens thought it was a church library. It was funded by the state aid, which was public funding. And since it was partially supplemented with those funds, people assumed that it was just the public, I'm told, the community, thought it was a church library, but it was absolutely a public library, community library. But many people in the community just did not know, so that was the reason that got turned around like that. And when funding stopped, that is, state aid was not coming in, that library was closed. The tiny room on the second floor, I'm told, at St. James closed about 39, somewhere like that. But this committee continued to lobby the public to get a building. And so they started working on that in 39 and 40. Reverend Burchett had this idea that continued after the library at the church was closed. And that committee started meeting and trying to get together a freestanding library. And they managed to do that because they absolutely went to council and talked to, have you do the speeches and try to get council to work with the city and work with the community to get funding and help with a program. And that's what they did. This library committee lobbied the council, and council agreed to get another library. They had funded one through the state aid that closed down when the funds stopped. So this committee continued to want to get a public library, and yes, it was called the same thing, Portsmouth Community Library. So they managed to get the city to come into this partnership. The thing about that is that the city said that the library committee needed to find the land. And Dr. John Jackson found 2 lots on South Street. And that's where the library, a separate building outside of the one that was in the St. James Church, started in 1945 until 1963. I think I was passed the baton from First President Charles Whitehurst, and it came on my watch. And the thing is that the society, was meeting at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And the city seemed to be going through rounds of redevelopment, and they were tearing down so many historical sites. And as we met at Ebenezer Baptist Church, many of the members said, well, we have a historical building right here at this church on the parking lot. Whatever they tear down that's near and dear to the black community, don't let them, the city, tear down this little library that was the first freestanding library for African Americans.
The African American community in Portsmouth, this library wasn't just a library, it was the center of the community.
Well, I think, this connection with the library provided the foundation for learning, for being inquisitive about the world, and certainly had an impact on my life and on my orientation towards life and my desire to put myself in a position through preparation to make a contribution.
I can't remember exactly how I heard about it. I think May made a phone call to the Virginian Pilot, and I was at the time a staff writer covering Portsmouth Community News. And so I think that call was fielded to me, and I spoke with her, and it sounded very interesting to me. I have a personal interest in historic preservation, and so I was immediately drawn to the story, and my editor, gave me the approval to move forward. And so I remember our first meeting, I think we met at the library, if I'm not mistaken, and it was then in the parking lot of Ebenezer Baptist Church, and it was in a terrible condition. It looked like maybe homeless people had been living there. It was dilapidated. I don't think there was any power on. It was just in bad shape. But I saw her vision, and I saw her excitement, and I knew she was going to get it done, even from that first moment.
I did graduate work in college in history, and my interests are in material culture and public history. So material culture consists of artifacts, archaeology, historic sites, historic buildings, non-written texts. And that goes hand in hand with African-American history, other history that doesn't have a lot of, earlier African-American history, colonial, here in the U.S., where you use those items to learn about the lives of people who didn't write things down, women, for a large part of our history. Public history is, instead of the more academic route, it's museums, historic homes, that sort of thing. So the African American Historical Society and this library project are exactly what I'm interested in intellectually, and as someone who likes to experience culture, that's my interest. I was around African American communities growing up in Chicago.
With the church as the focal point, these urban communities included schools, small businesses, modest homes, and a public library.
When I came to Portsmouth, and that was in 1986, I would early on hear about a building that was relocated that was known as the Colored Library. And in those early years, kind of asking some questions, because I would hear conversations, someone said to me, well, if you go down Effingham and you go by Ebenezer Church, that building in that parking lot was the building that was the Colored Library. So there were many instances that I would just pass and look at the building and not knowing any history, but just listening to the people who said that was the Colored Library. It was not until I became deputy city manager, and the city manager was Mr. Luke McCoy, who said to me, you need to go over and look at that building. And so upon that assignment, myself and some other persons, Bill McGlaughlin, who at that time was the director of properties management, we went over with some others and looked at the building and actually peeped inside. And when you looked inside and knew what this building had served and how it had served a whole community, there was something that you felt when you looked inside.
This building remains a symbol of our nation's struggle for civil liberties and equal rights. It's the very place where Drs. Holly and Owens refused to accommodate the twisted book borrowing policies of the public libraries in Portsmouth. It's where their determined protest led to the changes necessary for the equal treatment of the races in Portsmouth's library system. It's a very real symbol of our whole nation's struggle for liberty and justice for all citizens. Just as we remember the 4 little girls who died in the bombing of the 16th Street Church in Birmingham, when we walk by the building and visit the surrounding neighborhood, the Civil Rights Institute, and the statues of attacking dogs and fire hoses, so the Portsmouth Colored Library can serve to remind us of the events of its history while we learn about the struggles for civil rights in our country. Just as we're able to march across the Selma to Montgomery Highway or walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, so we're able to remember while learning about the sacrifices others made for equal voting rights. Ladies and gentlemen of Portsmouth City Council, you cannot demolish your unpleasant history. You must preserve it so that we all might learn from the injustices of the past, the bravery of Drs. Owen and Holly, and how they overcame the system in order to freely share rights with white people of Portsmouth. I believe that's a bit of what I might have said to the City Council that night.
The only libraries that were available for black students in Portsmouth operated in their inadequate schools, although the general black population had no access. Not to be discouraged, African-American citizens in Portsmouth rallied at a meeting of the Mission Study Group at Monumental M.E. Church on February 23, 1927. Of course, the library wouldn't be possible without the help of its first librarians. Mrs. Kitty Leary, a former librarian from Richmond, Virginia, trained the workers who were to take care of the proposed library. Mrs. Bertha Edwards, a 1942 Hampton Institute graduate with library science and social studies training, became its first librarian. The library thrived steadily under the leadership of Mrs. Edwards, who had an assistant, Mrs. Charlotte Fawkes.
And that was what her real talent was. She and Charlotte Falk. Charlotte Falk eventually became head of the lending department. Well, the two incidents that I wanted to tell you about that I particularly remember, one was in the early 60s. There was an altercation with students at IC Norcom, and they believed that there was going to be a race riot. And of course, in the early 60s, race riots happened around the country. Well, Mrs. Edwards and Mrs. Falk had made the library so much a part of the African-American community as well as the white community that one morning I came into the library and when they thought the riot was going to start, and painted on the front door was Soul Brother. And so that if they did burn buildings in downtown Portsmouth, they wouldn't burn the library. Isn't that a beautiful story?
That's a beautiful story.
And Mrs. Edwards and I, the other story that I remember so wonderfully was Mrs. Edwards and I, the old Portsmouth Star newspaper had been bought by the Norfolk Ledger and made into the Ledger Star and made a Norfolk paper. Well, the Norfolk newspaper came over to get the things it wanted out of the old Star office. And all they wanted was the filing cabinets. So they took the drawers out of the filing cabinets and emptied them on the floor. Well, about 10 years later, Mrs. Edwards finally talked them into letting her go into the Portsmouth Star building, which was on the southwest corner of Water and High Street. And there was no electricity, there was no heating, there was no electricity, and no water. And Mrs. Edwards recruited me to go with her. We were particularly looking for the photographs that had been taken by a famous African-American newspaper reporter, Lee Rogers. And it was an amazing experience. When we went into the building, we were wearing coats and gloves, and we had flashlights, and the pictures were ankle deep on the floor. And we were like two children on an Easter egg hunt, running through all of those things and finding as many of Lee Rogers' pictures as we could possibly find. And Mrs. Edwards took those pictures back to the library and made them into scrapbooks that are still in the local history collection and were part of the basis of the wonderful picture history of the African American community in Portsmouth. And then we've got the old newspapers, which were in terrible condition, and I succeeded in getting Bell and Howell and the State Library to put them on microfilm, or else all of the columns would have been lost as well. Well, when I became director of libraries, the first thing I did was create a Friends of the Library. Miss Kirkpatrick had never liked the idea of that because she thought that it might compete with her management. But I thought Friends of the Library was just what we needed, and it has been a boon to the community ever since, as you know. Because of Mrs. Edwards and Mrs. Falk being on the committee that made the list of the people who might be interested in serving on the Friends, the first Friends of the Library was almost 50-50 integrated, and two of the first presidents of the Friends of the Library were African American.
What do you remember about using that library?
Most notably, encyclopedias. We did not have a number of books at our house, and I would go to the library and I would start, Miss Edwards, she said, well, why don't you sit down and read something? And she said, read the encyclopedias. And I started from A through Z. And I lost myself in traveling to different countries around the world, and I would go home and tell my parents about, I've been to this place, and I just started going from there. And so it was just that the encyclopedias were the most important part of the library to me.
For 4 years, blacks traveled to the second floor of the parish house to read and borrow books. That is, until 1941, when municipal funding was cut, forcing the library to close its doors. By 1945, 2 lots at 804 South Street near Effingham were secured, and monies were raised to construct a 900 square foot brick building at a cost of $11,500. On December 20th, 1945, the library was dedicated with an impressive program at the Fourth Baptist Church. Despite the excellent services provided by Mrs. Edwards and her staff, the colored library was still inadequate for the large and growing black population. In 1959, on the eve of the city's efforts to expand white-only library services, 2 local dentists, Dr. James Holly III, the future mayor of Portsmouth, and Dr. Hugo A. Owens, filed a lawsuit against the city to gain access for African Americans to the public library. U.S. District Court Judge Walter Hoffman ruled on December 20th, 1960, that the library must allow access to everyone or close down, lock, stock, and barrel. In 1962, the Portsmouth Colored Community Library's collection was integrated into the city's public library system, and Mrs. Edwards became a reference librarian, eventually retiring in 1980. After the library services merged, the city planned to demolish the building, but Ebenezer Baptist Church requested the relocation of the building to their parking lot in an effort to preserve it and to use it for additional space. It was subsequently moved to their lot and was used for several years for the Scouts, a clothes bank, and general meeting space. Threatened with demolition, the African-American Historical Society of Portsmouth was determined to preserve the structure, even though the Ebenezer Baptist Church leaders decided that the building was an eyesore and no longer needed by its congregation. Led by dedicated volunteers, including Mae Breckenridge Haywood, Iva Faust, Ollie Boone, Doris Sheldon, Margaret Windley, Marilyn Wiggins, Howard Faust, and Sarah Wilson. The Society saw its potential as an important historic building for the community and possible Black History Museum site. After a long fundraising effort and with the cooperation of the City of Portsmouth, the Historical Society arranged for the building's final move in 2007 to 904 Elm Avenue.
And when I became the treasurer of the City of Portsmouth, the city was starting to destroy and get rid of history. That made me sad, so I decided I would do something. So I ended up creating or becoming a founder for the History Commission, and also was concerned about the library. And we got the city to move it to its current location.
It had been moved once to Effingham Street, and she showed me the building, and I mean, you can't help but fall in love with it. It's such a lovely little building, and it was still intact, and it still had a lot of its original detailing. And you can just look at it and say, okay, this place is important, this place needs to be preserved, and it needs to be able to tell a story. So from that point on, we helped Mae get measured drawings of the building because there was no documentation of the building whatsoever. So we did measured drawings of the building, and then we did an overall plan. We knew the building was going to be moved to Elm Street. So we did an overall plan of what if the building expanded and became, a larger center. What would that look like on the site? And then we did the construction documents so we could get a contractor to restore the building. Then we got the contractor and we did the work, and that's the fun part, is actually doing the work. Yes, that's the fun part.